Welcome to Global Studies 9.
Dun 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 dun. The Chapter 14, Section 1. The Crusades. So these Crusade slides may look a little different than usual. This is because these slides were taken from last year's Miss Georgie's Global Studies 9 section. Now the Crusades refers to the series of battles which took place between the Muslims and the Christians, which also eventually included the Orthodox Christians and the Jews. There are various factors why these battles begun, and there are also various battles that included, as I mentioned a second ago, non-Muslims and non-Christians as well. So this is a modern day map, and you can see in modern day it would be where Israel would be. You can see Jerusalem is right there, and the idea was for the Christians is to gain back that territory which was taken from the Seljuk Turks around the 11th century. It was holy to the Christians because it was where Bethlehem exists, where Jesus was born. It was where Jesus was baptized, and it was also the city where Jesus was crucified. At the same time, this area had a lot of importance for the Muslim faith as well. For Muslims, it had the Dome of the Rock. It also was the home of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was considered the third holiest site in Islam. And of course, not to mention, many Muslims live there. Now, it was in the earlier days when the Abbasid kingdom and other Muslim groups were there in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, matters were relatively peaceful. And this is because as long as you paid a tax, if you're a Christian or Jewish, it was okay to live in those areas. It was when the Seljuk Turks started to come in where things got very violent and contentious. And they also began to have little battles, which would be considered in what would be modern day southern parts of Europe between Muslims and Christians. The official start of the so-called Crusades came when the Catholic Church, led by Pope Urban II, called for Christians throughout Europe to go on a crusade and regain this lost territory by the Christians. One of the main motivations he provided people was this idea of forgiving indulgences. So the idea here was that by going to this holy land, quote unquote, that people's sins would be forgiven, and even if they died in battle, their sins would still be forgiven. So it was a win-win situation. You do well in battle, you gain the territory back, and even if you die, any sins you have are forgiven. Furthermore, many crusaders felt like they would win because they thought their God was on their side. Now the first crusade began with a bang. It worked out very well because the Muslims were not prepared, and many Europeans went on this crusade, including peasants with no skills, and most of all, the crusade was supported financially by various royal families. So although many peasants died before arriving, at the end of the day, the crusaders were successful, and within half a decade, by just the turn of the 11th to 12th century, they managed to take back what was once controlled by the Christians and were considered the Holy Land, and set up what were known as Crusader states. Now, earlier I did explain a few reasons why individuals may have chosen to go on these crusades, but I just want to reiterate 5 points of why people would participate in the crusades. So number one, people believed that it was a way to show their devotion to the church. They could show how they are true Christians by going on the crusades. This is irregardless of what class they belong to. Reason number two, the pilgrimage promised people that if they had any sins, that these sins would be forgiven, right? As mentioned earlier, the indulgences. Number three, people went on crusades because they believed it helped unify the community. And some hoped that the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church would unite through this unified goal of taking back these quote-unquote holy lands from the Muslims. Point number three, in feudal Europe, if you weren't one of the eldest sons, it meant that you weren't inheriting any land. And as a result, a lot of these younger sons who had a certain amount of money but no real future in regards to having the ability to inherit land, they looked at it as a chance for them to gain wealth and power that perhaps they wouldn't gain if they had stayed in Europe. And last but not least, fear. Islam was growing stronger. The Seljuk Turks were quite aggressive in regards to their expansion of territory. And the red dots in this map here, in the bottom half, you could see they represent jihad and the Islamic attacks in the name of expansion of the jihad. And there was a lot of fear in Europe that if they didn't do anything about this expansion of Islam, that eventually Islam would take over Christianity. After the First Crusades, the Crusaders have created several Crusader states, and these Crusader states would eventually be taken over by the Muslims, so they took back the territory they lost in the First Crusade, and this reignited the Europeans to get together and go back to the quote-unquote Holy Lands. This was a failure, and the Muslims were able to thwart away any type of attacks the Crusaders had for them. Now, the Third Crusade really revolves around two people, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, was able to thwart away various attacks, and he was able to stop the Third Crusade, which one of the key characters in the Third Crusades for the Europeans was Richard the Lionheart. And at the end of this crusade, the two came up with an agreement that Christians would no longer attack this territory as long as they're given the permission to make at least a religious pilgrimage, the rights to visit that area with no weapons. And things ended forever happily ever after. Incorrect. They did not end happily ever after. In fact, we had what was called the Worst Crusade, the Fourth Crusades, in the 1202 AD, where the Christian forces marched southward, but then you'll notice they make this strong turn eastward towards Constantinople, where they attack Orthodox Christians, right, not the Muslims, and they sack the city of Constantinople. And this was all about power and money. Those in the Crusades just wanted to make money quickly. They wanted to find wealth. And for them, it wasn't really about the Holy Lands or Jerusalem or fighting for Christianity. For them, it was about power, and they went on to sack the people from their very own religion. And there's also the Fifth Crusade, which is also, no surprise, a failure. Then we have the Sixth Crusade. This is most well remembered as the crusade involving the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. And in this crusade, he's able to come up with a treaty, kind of similar how the Third Crusade had a treaty where Christians would be able to control certain parts of Jerusalem. And this was a big, big breakthrough because now Christians, although they didn't get, what Pope Urban originally wanted in the First Crusades, all that land back, now they actually have a little bit of sovereign territory in what would be considered Jerusalem. Then we have the Seventh and Eighth Crusades, both failures. And finally, the end of the Crusades, the last one, the ninth one, the last official crusade. And in this one, Louis IX, who was also involved with actually the Seventh and Eighth Crusade, goes on to fight against the Muslims, and he dies in this crusade, and this is known as the last final one in the history books. With that said, keep in mind this territory continued to have a lot of territorial dispute for centuries and centuries, and as we know from our Judaism unit, that this territory was controlled in the early 20th century by Muslims, but then handed over to the British, and then handed over to Israel, and then of course between Israel and neighboring states, whether it be Egypt, Palestine, there's been constant conflict over the city of Jerusalem ever since. And even today, in the 21st century, that territory is very much highly disputed and a major political issue in the world today. Now, when we look at the effects of the Crusades, there's a lot more than just simply land being won and land being lost. In fact, throughout this Crusades and fighting, a lot of cultural diffusion occurred. A lot of culture was exchanged, whether it be ideas or products. So, for example, through these trades, we see things like coffee, sherbet, dates, lemons, sugar, ginger, all these major food items cross borders, which weren't being traded before. In the same manner, we also see major trade in household items like mirrors, carpets, ship compasses. All these things are traded throughout this time period when the Crusades took place. And finally, when it comes to ideas, we have things like Arabic figures, pain-killing drugs, even major concepts like algebra and chemistry. A lot of these things make way from the Middle Eastern world into Europe, helping push forward Europe in regards to science and technology. So at the end of the day, were the Crusades a success or a failure? Well, when it came to the battles, clearly it was a failure, right? 8 out of 9 failed attempts to capture the Holy Land. With that said, not everything was in vain. There were these various trades, whether it be algebraic numbers, chemistry, various food items, making it through to Europe. And in that sense, not all was negative for the Europeans, keeping in mind that 8 out of 9 of these crusades ended up a failure. And as I mentioned a second ago, it is a still very interesting issue in the sense that although we no longer have knights and people fighting, people going on these long voyages from Europe to the Middle East to regain that territory, we do see a lot of fighting over the city of Jerusalem between Muslims and non-Muslims, which still continue today. Very interesting stuff. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Have a nice day. See you. Goodbye.
I'm talking about the